Alrighty, our seventh tradition states every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting. Declining outside contributions, we will pass the basket. This is a weekly step meeting. Our format is as follows. A speaker, Brian, is asked to talk for 25 to 30 minutes on the step of that week, which is step 6, followed by a discussion on questions until 7 p.m. You can find these weekly meetings on our YouTube page, the Conscious Contact Speaker Group of Doylestown. Don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe and share. Okay, that brings us to the speaker portion of the meeting on this day and month in Doylestown, PA, at the Monday night, 6 p.m. Stay Alive Literature and Script Group at St. Paul's Lutheran Church. Tonight's speaker is Keith. Brian. And we will be sharing their experience on step 6. Please help me welcome Brian.
Thanks, Gary. How's everybody doing? My name's Brian. I'm an alcoholic. Thanks,
Brian.
Gary, for asking me to come out here. Where do I want to start? I got a sobriety date. It is May 8th of 2014, so I got a little over 10 years sober. I do have a home group, which is, as Gary mentioned, the Conscious Contact Speaker Group. We meet in this room right next to here on Saturday nights. It's a great speaker meeting, and I was thinking as Gary opened up the meeting and talked about how we had a great speaker in here, what he didn't mention was if you're sitting here thinking, oh, I missed it, that stinks, we record all our speakers, right? And as he said, we put it all on YouTube, so if you would like to listen to that speaker or any number of speakers we've had in the group, it's something that we do. We record our speakers and put it on YouTube, and it's an incredible thing, man. It's an incredible thing to be a part of that and to be able to help others by being, letting God use me as that tool to, be there to help facilitate that meeting and, not even know like where that pays dividends in my life.
You do a great job up on stage.
Thanks,
You're the best looking.
I guess for tonight, I guess what I'll do is I will briefly qualify, right, and then I'll talk a little bit about my experience with the steps. I think try to kind of focus on step 6 and really like hone in on 4 and 5, which are kind of integrally tied to step 6, but just have a little discussion on what that looks like in my life and working on those character defects. But I am an alcoholic, right? It says in the doctor's opinion, right, that men and women drink because they like the effect produced by alcohol, and that is my experience, that I am an effect drinker. Growing up, I always start off by saying, like, I just had a pretty solid childhood. I never had, like, any type of trauma in my life or bad influences, or there was nothing like that I point to early in my life where I think like that was a contributing factor in why I became an alcoholic, and I think a lot of people have that. A lot of people have, difficult upbringings. It wasn't my experience. But the bottom line is that I think many alcoholics, we will look at X number of reasons, and I'm sure I did coming into the program to say, these are reasons why I drink. If you had my life, if you knew what alcohol did for me, you would drink. But what it boils down to is, like I said, I'm an effect drinker. I like the effect that alcohol had on me. It gave me a sense of ease and comfort that prior to finding alcohol I could not achieve, through any means that I could find in my life, despite countless attempts through growing up and finding every which way, whether it be, all these interests and girls and this and that, always trying to move on to the next thing, finding the next distraction, the next thing that's going to take me out of myself. It was, that's really what it was constantly. And when I finally found alcohol at the age of, 15 years old, that was the perfect solution for me. And I pursued that pretty quickly and pretty aggressively in pretty short order until, I kind of, that became the norm. It says like the alcoholic life becomes normal. And that's really what it was for me. It was like all areas of my life sort of kind of fell by the wayside, and everything in my life kind of became a routine to suit my alcoholism, and I was pretty okay with that for a long time, you know what I mean? And it was always just kind of one step forward, 2 steps back in pretty short order. Started experiencing consequences as a result of my drinking. Never was really willing to look inward and look at my part of it. It was always kind of like I'm a victim of circumstances for the most part, like these things happen and it's, whatever the consequences look like in my life, which for me, it was always problems at work, like I'm going to get fired, problems with relationship, financial problems, getting arrested, legal trouble, all those things that come with the territory, you know what I mean? And none of those prices were enough to stop me or really even slow me down. You know, I usually talk about how I had this repeated behavior of, you know, like I said, I experienced some kind of consequence, and you know, like I'm a fear-based person. I love how in Bill's story he talks about like fear sobered me for a while, because that was like my drinking for the better part of a decade to a T. It's like I experienced some kind of consequence as a result of my drinking, and what do? I pump the brakes. I feel like I have to impose my will on the situation. I have to prove to myself first and the people about me that drinking is not problematic in my life. So I impose my will. What does that look like? Usually maybe I swear off for a day or two, maybe a better part of a week, and I always ease myself back into it. Never swear off completely, right? It's just like I have to control and manage my drinking, which was always my attitude. All the way coming up into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous at the age of 27, right? Like I said, in 2014, was arrested for my second DUI and a couple of other charges. And, you know, despite all that, despite all the indicators and other people in my life looking like, you know, this is a problem. And I think to myself at that point, I was willing to concede that alcohol was a little bit problematic. But to me, the idea of permanent abstinence from alcohol was unimaginable. You know what I mean? I was not someone that came into Alcoholics Anonymous desperate and willing to, you know, I wasn't at that point of desperation where I was willing to swear off and completely concede myself to this program, right? I was more of the mindset of like, you know, I was still full of a lot of pride and ego and fully convinced that I was going to figure this thing out on my own. Went into treatment, right, figuring out that I could pick and choose the bits and pieces of the program that were convenient for me and were applicable for me, right? Maybe do the steps that are applicable to me, like that kind of mindset, you know. And that's just the way it was, like going through treatment, you know what I mean? I thought that I was just very resistant to the idea. Like when I got out of treatment, you know, I went to a halfway house and they heavily recommended, actually required, otherwise, you know, I wouldn't be able to live at this halfway house, said that I had to get a sponsor, you know what I mean? And I was just so resistant to that idea of getting a sponsor, which, you know what I mean? At the time, I just looked at it, I didn't really consider it. Later on, looking through, you know, going through this process, I realized that was, again, like a character defect based out of a self-centered fear of like my resistance to authority, like the self-centered fear of like, I don't want to be controlled or be accountable to someone, you know what I mean? That's, you know, it was just like based in that resentment right there. You know, I don't need a sponsor. And like at the time, you know, like I said, I'd been arrested, was going through, you know, obviously naturally being defiant and not wanting another figure of authority in my life. You know, I'd already got the judge, already got the police, already got my family, my former employer, all these people kind of on my case, right? I don't want a sponsor, right? I'll just kind of read this book and like listen to what you say at your meetings and figure it out on my own, you know. So begrudgingly, right? Like, you know, I know Ron always says I was a reluctant participant in my sobriety, and that was my experience, you know what I mean? Reluctantly, I did get a sponsor, you know what I mean, and start going through this work. Was very selective, right? Because I thought I had to have the sponsor that was like had the same story to me and would understand me like to a T, you know, which is never the case, right? You know, I ended up getting a sponsor. He was a guy that was a little bit older than me, of course, and didn't really have like the story I had. He was like a family guy. I had never been married. He was really like just the alcohol was his problem, and I had like, you know, some of the drugs and stuff in my history. So I'm thinking right off the bat, right, because I distance myself and think that like my situation is unique and I can't be understood by somebody, you know, I just like distance myself and think. But it didn't really take too long with sitting down with this guy and getting into this book and getting into this step work and him sharing his experiences and just like the way he felt and the points of you know, darkness and desperation that he got to, that I really started to, you know, connect with him and be like, wow, you know, you kind of went through that and experienced that too. And, you know, that broke down some of those barriers for me, allowed me to like, you know, open up a little bit. And, you know, we got into that step work, you know what I mean? He had me, you know, get into, again, that fourth step, you know what I mean? I always talk about, like, my experience with that fourth step, putting stuff pen to paper. Like, nothing groundbreaking came out of that alone, you know what I mean? It was like I knew all the stuff I did for the most part. Was it uncomfortable, like, revisiting some of that stuff and putting it down on paper? For sure, you know what I mean? But, did that, and then we went through, and we're going through this fifth step, you know what I mean? And he's pointing out like my part and all of these things. And that was when it started to get a little bit eye-opening, taking that different perspective of like, that fourth column, coming back and looking at what my part in it is, you know what I mean? And that brings me to, I wanted to start off, talking about this sixth step, reading what it talks about in our book on the sixth step. And this is like, the paragraph prior to where it talks about the sixth step. And so to put in context, it is talking about here, this is at the point where we have finished this fifth step. So like I was saying, like, I finished my fifth step with the sponsor, and this is the instruction it does us specifically. This is what it tells us to do. After sitting down with that person, whether it be a sponsor, you know what I mean, whatever it is in your experience, this is what it tells us to do immediately. It says, returning home, we find a place where we can be quiet for an hour, carefully reviewing what we have done. We thank God from the bottom of our heart that we know him better. Taking this book down from our shelf, we turn to the page which contains the 12 steps, carefully reading the first 5 proposals. We ask if we have omitted anything, for we are to build an arch through which we shall walk a free man at last. Is our work solid so far? Are the stones properly in place? Have we skimped on the cement put into the foundation? Have we tried to make mortar without sand? And just to put you in the mindset of, how my experience with actually doing this and following this exact instruction, what I did. And this paragraph is preceded by what we refer to as our fifth step promises, you know what I mean? Which say we pocket our pride and go to it, illuminating every twist of character, every dark cranny of the past. Once we have taken this step withholding nothing, we are delighted. We can look the world in the eye. We can be alone at perfect peace and ease. Our fears fall from us. We begin to feel the nearness of our Creator. We may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but we now begin to have a spiritual experience. The feeling the drink problem has disappeared will often come strongly. We will feel we are on the broad highway, walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. And I always love this part of the book because I just think about like when I did this, when I followed this instruction, right, of like going through this stuff with my sponsor and sitting down with all of this newly uncovered information, right, getting this new perspective on myself. And and I always say like the thing that really shone through the most was, again, that fears list, right? You know what I mean? Because I'm looking at all this stuff, I'm looking at all these resentments and these harms done and these that are in these relationships in my life. And like everything is boiling back to all these self-centered fears that I have and decisions, like it says in this book, that I make out of self. I step on the toes of my fellows and they retaliate, right? You know what I mean? So I just have all this new perspective. And it says in this paragraph, right, like the feeling the drink problem has disappeared will often come strongly. Like if you're an alcoholic like me, that is a strong promise right there. And I can say honestly that I had like this experience, like prior to getting to this point of going through this fifth step, and sitting with myself quietly, and like as my sponsor would say, like just kind of connect the dots, right? And I love that description of it because that's what I'm doing. I'm just taking all this information about myself that I've newly uncovered and really just piecing it together to get this clear view of myself. And I really had that experience where like after that there was just this sense of like peace and contentment where like, you know, I wouldn't say like was that desire to drink gone entirely, but like there was just something happened in that moment, you know what I mean, in that hour where I just had this relief about me, you know what I mean. And it was an incredible thing, man. It really was, you know, like just to have that experience and just be free of that, you know what I mean. It was like this burden had just been like lifted off of me. It really was like an incredible thing, man. One way like the steps were described to me early on in my sobriety, which has always kind of like stuck with me, is, you know, someone told me that like the steps, when we look at it, it's like all about relationships, right? A lot of this stuff that we deal with in relationships. Like I come into Alcoholics Anonymous and I am just like this absolutely broken person. I have this terrible self-esteem, right? I'm full of this guilt, shame, and remorse. So I have this terrible view of myself, no relationship, like no positive feelings in relationship about myself. I have a complete void of like a higher power in my life, you know what I mean? So there's nothing there. All of my relationships, of course, with other people for the most part have been like burnt to the ground, you know what I mean? So through these steps, right, what I'm trying to do is like, first get this, in 2 and 3, get this conception of a higher power, right? Like get this broad idea of what a higher power might look like in my life. And 4 and 5, I'm trying to, you know, uncover this stuff that's blocking me from this higher power, you know what I mean? And I really feel like in 6 and 7, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get honest with myself and build this relationship with a higher power, this ideal of a relationship, which like, if I have this basic conception of what a higher power looks like in my life. And you know what I mean? I can't explain to you what it is or what it is, what it looks like to me even, you know what I mean? And that's something you have to figure out for yourself. But like, if I have these broad conceptions of like a God should be loving, it should be understanding, it should be selfless, right? All these positive things, right? And in 6 and 7, all I'm trying to do is align my will with that, right? I'm trying to have this relationship. Like if God is this loving, this infinite loving, an infinite giving thing, can I reflect that image? Can I start to have that relationship, you know what I mean? And have that reciprocal relationship of being like loving and honest towards a God of my understanding. And then obviously in 8 and 9, we're just trying to carry this ideal of what that relationship looks like into our other relationships in life, you know what I mean? And follow suit with that. And that's a pretty cool thing, you know what I mean? And it's a difficult thing to do at first, right? Because like I always say, I come in here and I think most of us, for the most part, not everybody, but most of us are lacking in the area of spiritual principles, right? Because I am not a naturally spiritually principled person. And I'm kind of like at odds with two different things, right? Like first of all, it's like the lifestyle I've been living has caused me to develop a lot of these character defects, right? And some of that stuff that I've just kind of developed over the years is maybe the stuff that you could say is a little bit easier to eliminate in the beginning, right? Like it's like the simple stuff. It's like I shouldn't be dishonest anymore. I shouldn't be stealing anymore. Like these learned behaviors, these things that I think are okay that are a little natural. And that's kind of the stuff that we start to address first. But then as I kind of work and live in this program, right, then we start to get down to the stuff like at my core, right? Like I am a naturally prideful, I am a naturally selfish person, right? And 6 and 7, that's like the stuff that I sort of like continually have to work at through this process. You know what I mean? And I don't do it perfectly, right? I don't think anybody does. Like, thank God I don't do it perfectly when I think about it, right? Because or I should say, thank God I don't believe I do it perfectly. Because if I thought I did it perfectly, and if I thought I was alleviated of all these character defects, like, why would I have to continue to go back to God, right? And continue to practice this kind of stuff in all of my affairs, you know? And luckily, I'm willing to humble myself, and I'm willing to continue to accept that like these character defects continue to crop up. You know what I mean? And it's like I need God in this, right? Because the way I see it, right, like I go through this process of like I come in here and like my only reality is like so like step 1, it's like I'm powerless over alcohol, right? And these steps are designed so intricately to like be this fact-facing and fact-finding process. So like all I can perceive when I come in here is like I'm powerless over alcohol, right? Like when I drink, bad things happen. And like we try to dig it back and like figure out the causes and conditions of this. And once I go through this work and do this inventory and I'm able to get the 6 and 7, right, I realize look, like all this stuff, like these resentments, these fears, these character defects, like this is the stuff that's causing me and driving me back to a drink. And like what I start to realize is I'm like just as powerless over managing these character defects in my life as I am over the drink, right? That's the thing. So that's like why this God component is so important, you know what I mean? And I think it's why there's not a whole lot that's talked about in 6 and 7, you know what I mean? Because there's this simplistic aspect of it. It's like there's not much more to describe than this or that. It's just like I am going to be powerless over this thing. I have to turn these character defects over to a higher power of my understanding and ask for the inspiration, ask for that intuitive thought as to like what I'm supposed to do in these situations and just try to get a little bit better each day, right? You know what I mean? And that's done again as these steps like all kind of tie together. Like doing a solid 10th and 11th step on a daily basis is really what allows me to carry out these principles of 6 and 7 into my life, right? Because if I'm continually vigilant about looking at these things as they crop up and try to correct them, I can maybe have a shot at being a little bit better tomorrow than I was today, you know what I mean? And that's really all we're trying to do here is just get a little bit better each day. Like I said, again, none of us are going to be perfect. Like I'm human. I'm going to fall short. These things are going to continue to crop up in my life, but am I willing over the long haul to try to get a little bit closer to God, like day by day on a daily basis, and I can say that for the most part, you know what I mean, over the past 10 years, I have tried to do that. I try to stay active with this program. I try to continue to help out others and try to get them to go through this work and be open-minded to this stuff, you know what I mean? I remember, like, my sponsor told me from the get-go, like, be open-minded, honest, and willing from the start, you know what I mean? And in that paragraph I talk about, right, you know what I mean, it's telling us, it gives us these specific instructions, right? Like I said, carefully read these first 5 proposals, ask if we have omitted anything, for we are building an arch through which we are going to, and like in the next paragraph, when it's talking about step 6, it says we have emphasized willingness to be indispensable, right? So if I'm looking at like what I've done in those first 5 steps, willingness is like the key to all of it, right? Like in step 1, I have to be willing to admit that I am powerless over alcohol. Step 2, I have to become willing to this broad conception that maybe there's a higher power of my understanding, right? Step 3, I have to be willing to turn over my will and my life to that higher power. I have to be willing and forward to put down that inventory, to get honest with myself and write that inventory. And in 5, I have to be willing to open up to somebody else and disclose that to someone else. So it's like, that stuff, I feel like that was such good advice. And what it's talking about here in this hour of quiet, you know what I mean? It's just like go over and just look at like, have I been open, honest-minded, and willing about everything that I've done up to this point in this process? And if I have, like it says, if I've answered to these questions to my satisfaction, as it talks about in the next page, you know what I mean, then I move forward with it. You know what I mean? I move forward with the steps, and I have taken that step. And it is like, you know, what it says in the big book. Like I said, there's not like a ton in here on 6 and 7, but I think that's intentional, because like I said, like there's not much more to be said about 6 and 7. Like, you know what I mean? When we talk about 7 here, it has this paragraph 7, it just gives us a prayer that we say, and it's like, and it says, you know, we have completed step 7, period. You know what I mean? And that's the simplicity of it. You know what I mean? It's trying to get us to this conception of like, you can't, you know, this is out of your hands. All you can do is turn this over to a higher power of your understanding, acknowledge these character defects, right? By going through 5 and 6, I at least have the awareness of what my character defects are. But okay, and then like I said, the willingness in step 6 is going to be so important, because I can have awareness of what my character defects are, but if I'm not willing to, you know, turn to God and ask for the inspiration and the strength to change these things, then nothing's going to change. You know what I mean? And that's really step 6 and 7 are obviously the point in this process where I'm really looking for that change to start to take place, right? I'm acknowledging all of this stuff I put down on paper, and I'm trying to, you know, look at that and ask God to give me the inspiration, give me the vision for what does that change look like in my life, and how can I achieve that, you know? But yeah, it's incredible stuff, man. Like I said, you know, I've tried to do a lot of this stuff and practice these steps to the best of my ability, you know what I mean, over the past 10 years of my sobriety. And you know what I mean, overall, like I said, is that there's good days, there's bad days, nothing's going to be perfect, you know what I mean, but overall it's been an incredible experience, man, you know what I mean. This program has given me a life beyond my wildest dreams, for sure, you know what I mean, like more than I ever could have imagined. Like I said, coming in here, I did not have any plans. Like I never thought when I came in the doors of that treatment center at 27 years old, someone who really was just thinking, I just got to stick around here for 30 days, 90 days to kind of get to my court date and hopefully, you know what I mean? And I was just lucky, you know what I mean? Like I said, that people like that came into my life and were willing to give me the time of day, you know what I mean? We're willing to bring a message of hope and recovery to me and help me have that vision for my life. Because I certainly didn't have it for myself, you know what I mean? But I always say that, like, in those early days, you know what I mean, I just came in and I got with the right people who were willing to, who, you know, I got to know these people that just had these stories like similar to mine, but their lives just looked so much different, you know what I mean? And I love like what I read right there. I remember having the experience in those 5th step promises, you know, there's this line in here where it talks about going from having we had certain spiritual beliefs and we now begin to have a spiritual experience. Like I had no idea. I talk about this like when I speak and tell my story that I was in a big book study and they read that like when I was real early on in my first month at this halfway house. And I was just like, I have no idea what that looks like in my life. But luckily I was surrounded by like this group of people that bared witness to the fact that they indeed knew what that looked like in their life and were fully convinced that if I followed these steps, those results could produce themselves in my life. You know what I mean? So despite the fact that I didn't have the vision for that at the time, and like I couldn't see that, you know, I was willing to put in the action, and that's what these steps are all about. It's like I was saying, do I have the willingness to take these actions and engage in these steps? And if I do, the results are going to produce themselves in your life. You know what I mean? Has been my experience. It's been my experience that like most people that give themselves to this program completely, they see these promises come true in their lives. You know, and it's a beautiful thing. It really is a beautiful thing, and it's available for everybody in here if you're willing to, you know, give it a shot. And I hope everybody gets to experience that in their lives. But I think that's all I got. We'll leave it there.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it, man. It comes to the time where we're going to open up the floor to sharing. Please keep your shares to the step. If you feel like drinking, or if you have had a drink today, please see me or speak to someone after the meeting. We ask that you please refrain from the use of profanity. We are in a church and on a spiritual journey. So, folks, I'd like to open up the floor. Anybody that